Have you ever felt like no one's mad at you, no one's avoiding you, but somehow no one really sees you either? You're doing everything right, staying calm, staying kind, staying helpful, but deep down you feel erased, not disrespected, just unregistered. You'll understand why by the end. You're not judged, you're not attacked, you're not envied or questioned or mocked, you're tolerated. Smiling, polite, well-adjusted. You nod at the right time, respond with just enough warmth to avoid suspicion, and blend into every room like background furniture, functional but forgettable. If someone asked your coworkers to describe you, they'd say, "Oh, he's nice, always helpful." If they asked the women you've dated why it didn't work, they'd hesitate. "He's sweet, I just didn't feel that thing." No one hates you. No one fears you. No one remembers you. And that's what slowly destroys you, because invisibility doesn't arrive like trauma. It seeps in like still water. No dramatic betrayal, no violent rejection, just a slow, consistent confirmation that nothing in you demands attention, that you can exist or not exist, and the world adjusts without effort. Most men in this position don't feel pain in the traditional sense. You don't spiral into breakdown. You don't erupt in anger. You drift. You live entire years with the quiet ache of being unregistered. And instead of seeing that as a crisis, you convince yourself it's maturity. As if disappearing is the price of being composed. As if being overlooked is proof you're evolved. You adopt passivity as a virtue because at least it doesn't hurt. But it does, just not loudly. This is Kierkegaard's darkest category of despair, not the man who knows he's in pain, but the one who doesn't know he's missing. Not knowing you're in despair because you've never dared to become someone who could be judged. Kierkegaard said, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." But how can you notice that when you've been rewarded your whole life for avoiding it? You think you're doing well because no one complains. But the silence isn't a sign of peace. It's a sign that you've been filtered out of significance. In rooms that reward assertiveness, you stay agreeable. In relationships that crave polarity, you stay neutral. In a world that respects conviction, you stay open-minded to a fault. You don't polarize. You don't lead. You don't offend. And slowly, you stop existing in the eyes of others because you never insisted on existing in your own. But that only becomes clear when the years begin to blend, when friendships stay surface level, when dates lose interest after 3 weeks, when nothing you build really feels like yours. And then the question arises, quietly at first, why does nothing seem to stick? Why do people smile but never stay? Why do I always feel tolerated but never chosen? That question is the fracture, and what follows is the confrontation. This invisibility wasn't chosen. It was constructed, piece by piece, through 1,000 small adaptations that felt reasonable at the time. The origin story is always the same, even when the details differ. Somewhere in childhood, you learned that being too much led to consequences. Maybe it was a teacher who said you were disruptive. Maybe it was a parent who needed you to be easier. Maybe it was other kids who made you feel like your natural energy was a burden. The lesson was clear. Visibility equals vulnerability. Being noticed means being criticized. Having opinions means being wrong. Taking up space means being selfish. So you learned to modulate, to read the room, to become what was needed rather than what you were. But here's the trap. What begins as strategy becomes identity. The child who suppresses himself to avoid rejection becomes the man who suppresses himself out of habit. The behaviors that once protected you now define you. You don't remember when you stopped having strong preferences. You don't remember when you started asking everyone else what they wanted before considering your own needs. You don't remember when your default response became "I don't mind" or "whatever works." The accommodation became automatic, unconscious, total. And this is where Kierkegaard's insight cuts deepest. Most men in this position believe they chose to be accommodating. You think your flexibility is a strength, your agreeableness is a virtue, your lack of demands is evidence of your emotional maturity. But accommodation born from fear isn't virtue, it's camouflage. The man who never disagrees isn't peaceful, he's paralyzed. The man who never asserts preferences isn't flexible, he's formless. The man who never causes friction isn't mature, he's absent. We tell ourselves we're being considerate, but we're actually being cowardly. We tell ourselves we're being wise, but we're actually being safe. We tell ourselves we're being evolved, but we're actually being erased. The most dangerous part is how seamlessly survival strategy becomes personality. The child who hides to avoid punishment becomes the adult who hides to avoid existence. The methods remain the same, but the reasons disappear into unconsciousness. By the time you realize what's happened, the pattern has become so embedded that you mistake it for your natural temperament. You think you're just laid back or go with the flow. You don't recognize that your entire identity was built around the avoidance of conflict, and therefore the avoidance of yourself. The strategy worked too well. It protected you from rejection by making you impossible to choose. It saved you from criticism by making you impossible to see. It kept you safe by making you disappear. The damage reveals itself slowly in fragments that don't initially connect. A woman you've been seeing for months suddenly ends things. She can't articulate why. Something about chemistry, about spark, about not feeling that thing she knows she needs. You were perfect on paper, kind, attentive, reliable, but somehow perfectly forgettable. Friends include you in group activities but never seek your individual company. You're always invited to the party, never invited to the deeper conversation. You're part of the collective but absent from the intimate. At work, you're valued but not promoted, respected but not followed. Your contributions are acknowledged but not remembered. You're the person they can count on, not the person they think of first. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. People like you, but they don't choose you. They appreciate your presence but don't crave it. They value your input but don't depend on your perspective. You've become the human equivalent of background music, pleasant, unobtrusive, and easily replaced. This realization arrives with a particular kind of violence, not the sharp pain of rejection, which can be processed and overcome, but the dull ache of irrelevance, which offers no clear path forward. Being hated would be easier to navigate than being tolerated. Hatred implies significance, even if negative. Tolerance implies nothing at all. You begin to notice the subtle ways you're excluded from deeper intimacy. Conversations become superficial around you because people have learned not to expect strong reactions. Friends share their real problems with others because they've unconsciously classified you as someone who offers comfort rather than insight. Women treat you as emotionally safe, which you're beginning to understand is not the same as emotionally compelling. Safety without danger is not intimacy, it's companionship. And companionship without tension is not connection, it's proximity. The most disturbing realization is that you've participated in your own erasure. You've trained people to treat you as a supporting character in their stories rather than the protagonist of your own. You've been so committed to being low maintenance that you've become no maintenance, and therefore no priority. Kierkegaard understood this as the violence of spiritual suicide, the slow murder of the self through excessive accommodation. The man who refuses to impose his existence on others eventually discovers that he has no existence to impose. You're not just unseen by others, you're becoming invisible to yourself. The silence around you begins to mirror the silence within you. You realize you've stopped having strong opinions, stopped setting boundaries, stopped asserting preferences. You've become so skilled at adaptation that you've lost the capacity for self-assertion. The person others overlook is the same person you've learned to overlook. When confronted with your invisibility, you reach for familiar explanations. You're not being overlooked. You're simply more evolved than those who need constant attention. You're not being ignored. You're just secure enough not to require validation. You're not disappearing. You're demonstrating emotional intelligence by prioritizing others' needs over your own ego. These rationalizations feel sophisticated, even noble. You tell yourself you're above the petty competitions that consume lesser men. You don't need to be the center of attention. You don't require constant affirmation. You're comfortable with yourself, which is why you don't need to impose yourself on others. But this supposed maturity reveals itself as something else entirely when examined closely. Your laid-back nature is often conflict avoidance. Your emotional intelligence is frequently emotional suppression. Your security is usually the absence of enough selfhood to feel insecure about. The most seductive rationalization is that you're simply more spiritual or psychologically advanced than those who require recognition. You've moved beyond the need for external validation. You've found peace in selflessness. You've discovered the wisdom of humility. But this spiritual bypass conceals a deeper truth. You're not beyond the need for recognition. You're terrified of seeking it. Your niceness has become a comprehensive defense system. By being consistently agreeable, you avoid the risk of disagreement. By being perpetually helpful, you avoid the vulnerability of needing help. By being eternally accommodating, you avoid the exposure of having needs that might be rejected. Your virtue is actually a sophisticated form of hiding. Kierkegaard understood this as the despair of the man who refuses to be a self while convincing himself that selflessness is enlightenment. You haven't transcended ego. You've surrendered it. You haven't found peace. You've found numbness. You haven't discovered wisdom. You've discovered a way to avoid the risk of being wrong. The tragedy is that your niceness has become so total that you've lost access to your own complexity. You've trained yourself to be consistently pleasant, which means you've lost the ability to be authentically present. You've become a curated version of yourself, optimized for social acceptance rather than personal truth. The person you present to the world isn't false, but it's incomplete. It's the version of you that survives scrutiny, not the version that thrives in authenticity. You've become so skilled at being acceptable that you've forgotten what it feels like to be actual. Most men in this position don't recognize their niceness as a strategy because the strategy preceded their conscious memory. You've been nice for so long that you think niceness is your nature. But nature doesn't require constant vigilance. Nature doesn't need to be maintained. Nature doesn't collapse when you stop performing it. Your niceness is performed, and the performance is exhausting, even when you don't realize you're performing. The erosion reaches a critical point when you realize you're not just invisible to others, you've become invisible to yourself. You've lost track of what you actually want, feel, or believe. Your preferences have become so attenuated through constant accommodation that you're genuinely uncertain about your own desires. When someone asks what you want to do, you experience a moment of genuine confusion. Not because you're being polite, but because you've stopped tracking your own internal signals. You've become so skilled at reading social cues that you've lost the ability to read your own. This self-erasure manifests in small but significant ways. You can't remember the last time you felt strongly about anything. You've developed the habit of asking others what they want before considering your own preferences. You're more aware of others' comfort levels than your own. The most unsettling realization is that you've stopped dreaming with any specificity. Your goals have become generic. Be happy, be successful, be good. You've lost the capacity for vivid desire, for specific longing, for the kind of wanting that creates direction and purpose. Your desires have become as invisible as your personality. Kierkegaard wrote about this as the deepest form of despair, the despair of the man who has forgotten what it means to be himself. This is not the despair of failure, it's the despair of never having attempted anything specific enough to fail at. You're not suffering from the pain of rejection. You're suffering from the absence of anything substantial enough to be rejected. The silence within you has become louder than the silence around you. You're not just overlooked by others, you're overlooked by yourself. You've become so practiced at self-suppression that you've lost access to the self you've been suppressing. You've achieved the perfect camouflage. You've become invisible even to your own perception. This internal absence creates a particular kind of psychological vertigo. You're not depressed in any clinical sense. You're not suffering from the presence of pain, but from the absence of substance. You're not struggling with difficult emotions. You're struggling with the lack of any emotions strong enough to struggle with. You're not fighting your demons. You've discovered you successfully eliminated them along with everything else. The most frightening realization is that you're not even sure what recovery would look like. You've been invisible for so long that you've forgotten what visibility feels like. You've been accommodating for so long that you've forgotten what your own preferences feel like. You've been nice for so long that you've forgotten what your authentic responses feel like. This is the deepest level of Kierkegaard's despair, not knowing you're in despair because you've never known what it feels like to be yourself. The path out isn't about becoming louder, colder, or cruel. It's about becoming real, about developing shape, boundaries, gravitas, about accepting the tension of judgment, disagreement, exposure. This requires confronting the fundamental terror that created your invisibility in the first place. The fear that if people see you clearly, they'll reject you. The fear that your authentic self is somehow insufficient, flawed, or unworthy of acceptance. But here's what you've missed. By avoiding that potential rejection, you've guaranteed actual irrelevance. By protecting yourself from being disliked, you've made yourself impossible to love. By staying safe, you've made yourself forgettable. The man who can't be rejected can't be chosen. The man who can't be disliked can't be desired. The man who can't be criticized can't be respected. Kierkegaard understood this as the paradox of authentic existence. To be yourself, you must be willing to be rejected for who you are rather than accepted for who you're not. This doesn't mean becoming disagreeable for its own sake. It means becoming substantial enough to generate genuine responses. It means having enough internal weight that your presence creates gravitational pull rather than background noise. Authenticity isn't about revelation, it's about resistance. It's about developing enough internal solidity that you can't be easily moved, shaped, or accommodated. It's about becoming someone who requires consideration rather than someone who provides it. The process begins with small acts of self-assertion, not aggression, but presence, not demands, but preferences, not conflict, but boundaries. Each time you choose your authentic response over your accommodating response, you create a small fracture in the pattern of invisibility. People will notice. Some will be confused by your newfound substance. Others will be uncomfortable with your reduced availability. A few will be threatened by your refusal to disappear on command. These responses aren't signs that you're doing something wrong. They're signs that you're doing something different. And difference, after years of sameness, feels like violence to those who benefited from your absence. But something else will happen too. The people who matter will see you more clearly. The relationships that have depth will deepen. The connections that were built on your accommodation will fade, making room for connections built on your actual presence. You'll discover that the fear of rejection was worse than rejection itself, that the fear of judgment was more paralyzing than judgment itself, that the fear of being too much was more limiting than being too much itself. Most importantly, you'll discover that being seen, really seen, is worth the risk of being rejected, that being chosen for who you are is worth the risk of being overlooked for who you're not. The invisible man doesn't become visible by demanding attention. He becomes visible by demanding nothing except the right to exist as himself. And that demand, paradoxically, is what makes him impossible to overlook. You thought no one saw you, but maybe you've spent your whole life making sure they never had to.